ABC Listen. Podcasts, radio, news, music and more.
Today on Conversations, it's a love story with some beautiful music in the background and in the foreground too. Charmian Gadd started learning the violin at the age of 3. Later in life, Charmian was given lessons by an extraordinary man named Richard Goldner, a brilliant musician who had come to Australia after escaping the Nazis in Europe. After Richard Goldner came to Australia, he not only started Musica Viva, the chamber orchestra group, which is still going strong today, he also invented a new kind of zipper for the war effort. Charmian and Richard fell in love, and they lived and travelled and performed all over the world together for decades. It was after Richard died that Charmian walked into a shop in New York and met another great love of her life, an exquisite violin that cost almost as much as a house, and in her 80s, she still plays it. Hi, Charmian.
Hello.
I want to start with your very early life, the place you grew up in on the central coast of New South Wales, Ourimbah. Tell me about the Ourimbah of your childhood, what it was like back then.
Well, we were the first European settlers of that bit of land. It was 48 acres that my mum had inherited from her mother. And her mother had been given it by the government because she had 2 sons that were lost in the First World War. So it was just timbered, and one of the rules of accepting this from the government was that you had to clear at least 5 acres of it. So can you imagine 5 acres of thick bushland, wonderful trees, blue gums and blackbutts and turpentines and ironbarks, all kinds of things.
And was it your dad who cleared it?
My dad and my mum and my mother's brother, my Uncle Bert.
And how did they do that? Did they get like a chain between 2 tractors? Did they do it that way? Or
No, just by hand. Axes and cross-cut saws, just one after the other. You had to cut them down, cut them up. We did have a horse that would... My father made a sawmill from an old tractor engine. They'd be dragged up to the saw bench. You'd cut them in various pieces and finally into building materials.
And he made a house out of that?
Yeah, he and Uncle Bert built that house.
And how basic was this house, Charmian?
Pretty basic. We had no electricity or phone or gas or anything. No water, no town water, no sewage, nothing. But in a way it was a paradise, Richard. In a way it was really... It was so close to nature. There was nothing between you and the birds, and they'd wake you up in the morning, the most beautiful butcher birds singing to you, kookaburras. They were all my friends, I was an only child. So it was a bit, I suppose it would have been thought to be a lonely childhood, but didn't seem it.
What were your parents like?
My mum was the youngest of 13 children.
Oof.
She was sort of, I think, forgotten pretty much by her family. Her older sister had already gone off and had her own family by the time Mum came along. And so she missed out on going to school to a very large extent. I think she didn't get to school until maybe a 2nd or 3rd class. And then when she got to high school, her mother was dying, so she was taken out of school at about 14 to look after her mother, who was in her last stages. So it's just a few years of schooling, really.
And how about your dad?
Well, they were an interesting family. The Gadds had come out from England. They were typical Victorian English people, really. Members of George Bernard Shaw's society and that sort of thing. Intellectuals, thinkers, atheists, very, very far left in terms of politics. It was they were famous in the area because they'd argue with anybody over religion, and everybody was pretty religious in those days.
When your grandfather was around, how would he wake you up in the morning?
Oh, that was nice. Yes, we had one of those wind-up 78 players,
An old gramophone?
Gramophone, that's the word, yes. And he would put on Morning from the Peer Gynt Suite by Grieg, and that beautiful
while birds are whittering in the background. How lovely.
It was wonderful, yeah.
That's a lovely way to wake up in the morning.
It's very, very lovely. So music was always there, and we used to listen to all sorts of things. So Dad had figured out how to make a radio, got all sorts of old bits from the rubbish tip probably, or given stuff by other people. There was no money around in those days at all. It was post the big depression, and that lasted for a long time up there. There were no jobs.
How did you get to school?
I walked a mile and a half.
Did you have a horse?
Not to ride, no. The horse was for sneaking logs around. I did have a bicycle, but it wasn't much use because it was all downhill on the way there and all uphill on the way home.
So given that you were living in, pretty rustic and beautiful circumstances, how were you introduced to the violin?
Friends, really. I was born in 1942, which is right in the middle of the Battle of Britain, I guess, Second World War. And we had friends who were musicians. They were studying at the conservatorium. And they were sent off to the war and taught how to shoot Germans and all that sort of thing. And then released back, as they survived, as rehab students at the conservatorium. So they left their rifles and their uniforms, which they were allowed to keep after the war, at our place in Arimbo. And they'd come up regularly just for fun to shoot rabbits, because we had a plague of rabbits, a terrible plague. They were eating everything. Right from when I was quite young, they'd be coming up for holidays. And you can imagine how I looked forward to these holidays. They'd disappear to various different parts of the property and practice. You'd hear, exercises and scales coming from one part and great beautiful Bach suites from a cello in another part. They brought music to the place where they'd be rehearsing their string quartets and solo repertoire for con exams. And also, of course, then my mum decided to learn the violin herself. And one of the violinists, Kevin Miller, particularly helped her a great deal and helped me. And she decided when I showed a bit of promise, I didn't even have a violin of my own, Richard. I was playing in a full-size violin and I was about 3 or 4. I was scraping away with the bow and my father would put fingers on the string and play a tune, So we'd play together. And I'd do the other thing. I'd put my fingers on the string and find the right notes, and he'd scrape away with the bow. It was all just fun, just the things you did, for entertainment.
And how did it get more serious than that?
Well, Mum realised I was gifted, so she put me for an exam, and I did quite well. And then she kept on with the exams, and Kevin Miller, my first teacher, you could say, helped to prepare things. And eventually I'd go down to Sydney for a Stedfords. Mum would put me in the Stedford. And the first Stedford, I was 8 years old, so I was in the 8 years and under. But I came second in the 8 years and under. This is without any teacher, really. So that was already good. But she also entered me in the 16 years and under because there was a set Mozart concerto there, which I just loved, and I played really quite well. Probably wrong notes, I don't know, but at that point I just played it with such enthusiasm that I got the first prize in the 16 years and under and the second prize in the 8 years and under. So my mum realised at that point that she had to get me to a teacher.
Were you composing as well?
Oh, yes. I'd had quite a lot of nice little songs, and one was played once when I was at school on the Terence Hunt show. I guess many people will remember that.
On the wireless?
On the wireless, that's right, in the school.
Right. So you were all listening around the radio, here's a composition by young Charmian Gadd.
That's
was
right.
It like that, was it? Right.
Can you imagine the embarrassment?
So when was it time for you to leave that lovely rustic home in Marimba?
High school, because as I say, Mum realised she had to get me to a teacher. By that time, we were preparing entry for the Conservatorium High School, which we had a bit of an entree to because we went to the con quite often with these friends, go down to hear them play, and whenever there was a great soloist coming or something, we'd go to the town hall and hear the Sydney Symphony Orchestra.
This is the days before the Sydney Opera House, where the Sydney Town Hall was the main music venue.
Oh, yeah, it was lovely. It was a very, very lovely venue. I think it still is.
Who came with you to Sydney?
Either my mum or my dad. We didn't have anywhere to stay over there, so we'd have to take the late train home.
And when it was time to go to the conservatorium?
Mum got a job in Sydney. We then rented a room with a widow in Mossman who kindly took us in.
She didn't mind a girl playing in
Practicing
the house?
Wasn't up to that one yet, but yeah. No, she didn't. She was very, very, very tolerant, fortunately.
How were your teachers at the conservatorium? Were they terribly, terribly serious in those days?
That was a bit of a disaster that first year.
Why?
Because it was felt absolutely correctly that I needed some discipline, right? Because I hadn't played scales much and I couldn't sight read and, I had all sorts of lacking skills.
You're a sprite of the forest, Charmian.
Yes, I was a wild child, and I really was too. I could shoot, I could, do all sorts of things that the kids in the Conservatorium High School were, I think, a bit amazed. Anyway, they sent me to a man called Florent Hoogstoel.
Ah, Florent Hoogstoel.
Hoogstoel. He was Belgian. He'd come over with Verbruggen, after whom the wonderful hall at the Conservatorium is now named. He was known as a disciplinarian, right? He would teach you technique and he'd be tough on you. So he had a terrific accent. I'd never even heard an accent before. I mean, I'd heard Northern England accents and Scottish brogue and all that sort of thing, but I'd never heard a French or Belgian accent. And I could not understand the man.
What would he say?
Well, when you take a up bow, your bow goes in this direction, a down bow, it goes in the opposite direction. He'd say, ubu, ubu, meaning up bow, and I'd say, I beg your pardon. And one day he lost patience with me completely. He'd said some long sentence and I just sort of went right over my head. I said, I beg your pardon. What he had said was, if you say I beg your pardon one more time, I will throw you out of the studio, right?
And you said?
And I said, I beg your pardon. It just didn't, nothing registered there. So he picked up my violin and he threw it into the case. And I walked over in a very dignified fashion to the case, put the violin in the case, closed it, and just walked out of the studio and announced to my school teacher that I was leaving that teacher. I was going to give up the violin if I had to keep studying with him. And my mum supported me 100% because she realised that I was just not getting anywhere. I hated him so much.
And so what happened? Did you get to change teachers?
Yes, I changed teachers. That was the end of the first year there. And
so he could shout ubu at other people then?
That's right, yeah. He lost a lot of students, I think, over the years, but he had a lot of good ones too.
This is Conversations with Richard Fidler on ABC Radio. You can subscribe to the Conversations podcast. To find out more, just head to abc.net.au/conversations.
So how did you first hear about a musician named Richard Goldner?
Well, Richard was doing stuff when I was just a child, I mean, he started music of even in 1945, right after the war. He'd come from Vienna. He was actually born in Romania. Jewish, of course. Was a well-trained musician from Vienna. Just barely escaped from there with his life.
How so? So after the Nazi Anschluss of 1938, was he there for that?
He was there at that time. He even had the stupidity to go to work the next day. He was playing in a group that contained quite a lot of people who had been illegal Nazis. In other words, they were members of the Nazi Party before it was legal, before the Anschluss. And oddly enough, one of them actually sent him food when he had to go into hiding. Now, he and his brother, Gerard, had married two sisters shortly before it was one of the last Jewish weddings while they were still allowed. And they were making applications, of course, to go everywhere in the world. He thought he could maybe go to Lima, but it's because he was born in Romania that quota was closed. All quotas were closed. So they applied to Australia, and they were always making things. They're very creative, the two brothers. They were making lampshades to go to Russia and God knows what, creating things. And they were making these lovely little brooches which were of the Bluebird of Happiness. And so Gerard, when they were making their applications to Australia, included one of these little brooches in their application, which of course was opened by a woman. That's a woman's job. And she loved this little thing, and she took it to the minister.
It worked.
And said, this would be a new industry for Australia. And it was. So by that ruse, they managed to get here.
So Richard and his brother then arrived in Australia.
With the two wives, yes.
Their two wives.
Yeah.
And what did they do once they arrived in Sydney?
Oh, well, they had people here that they knew. I think maybe even some family. So Richard, pretty soon as a musician, was taken in to audition for the Sydney Symphony Orchestra. So they offered him the principal viola position, but he was unable to take that because of the musicians' union wouldn't allow foreigners at that stage. So that went. But nevertheless, they got making things and doing things. And
What was the business they started?
I think it was jewellery. I think it was costume jewellery. And they had a little factory, I think, in the Strand Arcade in Sydney. And when war broke out, of course, this was declared a non-essential item. So that finished too. And because there'd been quite a bit of publicity, Richard, about this weirdo inventor who'd come from Vienna and was a musician and all that sort of thing, a lot of it got into the Sydney Morning Herald and the various papers of that time. And so he and his wife, Mandy, were living in Manly at the time, and suddenly somebody knocked on the door, and they went to the door, and it's this man in uniform, and you can imagine the chills that happened then. But he turned out to be a very, very lovely man who was searching out Richard for the Army Inventions Directorate. And sure enough, they put him to work as an enemy alien.
He was classified an enemy alien?
Yes.
Why, because he'd come from Austria?
He'd come from Austria, yeah.
Expelled as a Jew, he gets called an enemy alien in
It was
Australia.
still, because he came from there. I don't think they quite understood the subculture of that.
So he was put to work as an inventor?
Yes, he worked for the Army Inventions Directorate. Now, he couldn't drive. He was not allowed to drive. So a police car would pick him up every day and take him into the office, take him home.
And what did they want him to invent?
Well, there was a big project for the flight suits that RAAF, they had to have something that would cover them completely and be able to go around in circles and work when mud was in it and all that sort of thing. So they were looking for a zip fastener that would do all these things. And Richard came up with something, and you know what it was? It was a double helix. This is way before Francis Crick and those people came up with the
DNA spiral.
DNA spiral, yeah.
A double helix zipper?
Yeah.
Wow.
And he knew it would work. He knew in his mind it would work, but he couldn't really say why. So he and a patent attorney friend, Fritz Rice, who also conducted the Lindfield a cappella choir, another musician, they started drawing it and making mock-ups of it. And sure enough, of course, it worked. And it was used then by the forces in the Second World War.
What did he do with the money he got from that? He clearly had a patent, so did he make a lot of money out of that?
He was allowed to get a patent on it, yes. He had a patent on that mechanical principle, believe it or not.
And what did he do with the money from the patent?
Started Musica Viva.
He set up Musica Viva
Yeah.
with the money he got from inventing this new kind of zip.
Eventually, from selling that patent, a British firm bought it to keep it off the market. That was a really good time for him. That was fantastic. And then he read that his wonderful teacher and mentor, Simon Pullman, had been exterminated in Treblinka by the Nazis. So Richard just wanted to remember him by establishing a group such as he had in Vienna, which was the Pullman Chamber Orchestra, probably one of the best chamber orchestras ever. It consisted of 4 string quartets, 2 violins, viola and cello, so 4 of those.
So it was more than just a chamber group. It was a kind of an institution there.
Yes, it was a very, very highly revered institution there.
And that was the inspiration for Musica Viva for Australia. So we're now into the post-war years with that. That was his dream for Musica Viva, to have this, not just a chamber group, but an institution behind it.
I don't think he visualised too much about institutions and things like that. He wanted the group. The organisation sort of happened by itself. Musica Viva as an organisation developed a little bit later. The first concert was just Richard. It was known as Richard Goldner's Sydney Musica Viva. It was at the Conservatorium. On the day of the concert, then, there was a blackout in Sydney. So Richard, is not a man to take no for an answer. He went to Charles Moses at the ABC. Wonderful man. And he was the head of the ABC at that point. He was an army man, so he had generators and things like that at his disposal. He provided those for the concert. And
the ABC saves the day.
That's right. People had their cars in front of the hall, shining their lights for people to go into the hall. Richard, of course, had organised a lot of very pretty girls to use flashlights, torches, and show people to their seats. And so it was a really, really very romantic occasion, I understand.
So at what point did you meet Richard in your life then?
When I was 14, I was already at the Conservatorium High School, and I was playing in the Eisteddfod, another Mozart concerto. And Richard was the adjudicator. Now, my father, it was just before he died, was the Eisteddfod before he died. Every year he'd come down to hear me play in the Sydney Eisteddfod. So here we were in the small hall of the Conservatorium. It was an open concerto section in this case. And he gave me the first prize, but he did say something which in fact was a criticism, but my father thought it was a great compliment. That was that I played Mozart like Tchaikovsky.
Right. Okay. With a whole lot of romantic flourish there.
That's right,
words,
yes, and total commitment and guts and all that sort of thing, which was not very fashionable at that point in Mozart playing.
Well, I think it's marvellous, Charmian. I think Mozart always needed a bit more Tchaikovsky in him, just quietly, but that's just me. So he said that to you, but he gave you first prize, but with this kind of double-edged comment.
That's right, yes. He had to announce his comments publicly, and so that's what he said, and my father was most impressed. And then, of course, everybody smoked in those days. I don't know if you can imagine it, the small hall of the Conservatorium, Richard sort of searching around in his pockets for a match. He had a cigarette in his hand. Almost every photograph of him has him with the cigarette in his hand. And my father was a smoker too, of course. He was sitting right back in the hall. He didn't want Richard to know that he was my father. And Richard was obviously searching for a match, and my father threw him a box of matches. So that was the start of a great relationship.
So years later he became your teacher, your violin teacher then. What was he like as a teacher?
Well, extremely strict and very, very demanding, totally demanding. I got by, I think, with talent and with just enthusiasm and a lot of encouragement from a very good teacher. But she didn't quite demand the technical necessities there.
And what happened to you as a player, as a violin player, after studying under him?
I had a very tough time for a while. He reschooled my bow arm, and that meant quite a lot of really, really nasty stuff. In other words, Richard, he took me seriously.
So you went on at some point to study in the United States.
Yes.
At Indiana University. What was the plan?
Well, I'd won an overseas scholarship and that sort of thing. Musica Viva helped me a lot to go overseas. I had no idea where to go to study, frankly. We thought about Moscow because I loved David Oistrak's playing, and then Jascha Heifert's big name was teaching in California, so that was considered a possibility. But I really didn't know, and Henrik Schering, the great Polish violinist, came to Australia. I played for him, and on the spot he gave me pretty much an idea of who was what, where. And he said, and there's this wonderful man in Bloomington, Indiana, who's I would thoroughly recommend. So he got on the phone to Mr. Gingold, got me a graduate assistantship on the spot virtually, and I was off to Bloomington within that year.
So you arrived in the Midwest of the United States, and this is like the 60s, the early 60s, thereabouts?
Yeah, 63.
It's nice Kennedy-era America. Well, how did that strike you at the time?
Well, it was very backward, actually.
Really?
In many ways, the youngsters were pretty straight. And most of them had to go off to fight the Vietnam War, and they all had to do military service. But I made a lot of friends there, and they were lifelong friends.
And what did Joseph Gingold do for your playing?
Well, after the really tough years with Richard, where there was a lot of discipline to that, Gingold had discipline too, of course, but he was more along the lines of, you can do it, take the risk, go for it. I think go for it is the thing that he most helped me with, because perhaps by that time I was getting a little bit cautious or something, and he encouraged me in that regard.
Podcast, broadcast. This is Conversations with Richard Fidler. Hear more conversations anytime on the ABC Listen app.
So, Charmian, he'd been your teacher for some years. How did things change between you as you got older?
Yeah, that's a good question, but a very hard one to answer. Our relationship as a teacher and student was a very, very close one. And you can imagine probably how when you've got two people working so intently on somebody's abilities, I suppose it would be similar with sports, but probably not to the same extent. The shared love of music was a great thing, and all the disciplines that go with that, playing together in a group. The time that we spent together, we'd spend many hours a week together, and we became absolutely the best friends. Richard's life was kind of falling apart at that point. Financially, of course, he'd spent his fortune on...
The zipper fortune.
He'd blown it.
Right.
So he was, as I said before, working at a factory in St Mary's with his then wife, Mandy, and their relationship had not sort of lasted terribly well. And he was not treated very, very reverently by the conservatorium. They had their own agenda, and he didn't quite fit into it, so they brought in other people without offering a job to him. So after, we studied together for a couple of years, and then I won the ABC competition, what was called the Concerto and Vocal in those days, 1962, I guess it must have been. So that placed me pretty well on the map as a soloist. So we were sort of encouraging each other at that point. It was a very, very close relationship.
Was there a language between you and the music?
Oh, yes, yes. It's hard to describe to a non-musician, but yeah, there was so much shared there. I was 19 at that point, and just the fact that both of you were working so hard together on developing all those musical skills that were necessary at the same time. Spending a lot of time together. Richard was an excessively generous person. He would share everything. He'd always be taking people out to dinner, although he couldn't really afford it. He shared language. He taught me some German. He introduced me to all sorts of literature that he was reading, talked a lot about psychology. He just took me on as a human being. We had a wonderful time together then. That was a really creative and wonderful time.
Was it scandalous, the age difference between you when you fell in love?
Oh, yeah, sure. Yeah, of course. People were chin-wagging, but that didn't worry us too much. And we had a lot of friends who just understood the position and didn't bother with scandal. I encouraged him to leave Australia after I'd left. He was still here. I'd gone to the Tchaikovsky competition after I'd been in Bloomington for a while, came back and we prepared me for the Tchaikovsky competition in Moscow in 1966. So I went off to Cold War Moscow, had a wonderful time. I did pretty well. I got a Medal of Honor.
Have you a picture of Moscow in 1966?
Musically, it was wonderful. All the Russian competitors were selected years before the competition. They'd been prepared, to a fantastic degree, and gone around the country playing all their repertoire everywhere. These were the selected best, and they were fabulous. They were fantastically well prepared, just great, great players. there were some quite famous American musicians there too. There was a great deal of disorganisation. I remember somebody who was responsible for trying to book my flights back to Australia. He didn't know where Australia was. I think he thought it was Austria. But no, the whole experience was wonderful.
You and Richard lived in the United States together for a while.
Yes, we did. Oh, yeah. Well, first of all, we were in Pittsburgh, at Duquesne University in Pittsburgh, which was for 10 years. I tend to spend a decade in every place I go. At the same time, I was going back and forth from London then.
And that's when you got married to Richard?
Oh, that was in Australia. It was a very hot day and the arum lilies were wilting, and Ken Tribe from Music of Eva and his wife were our only people there, the witnesses. And so that was just a formality, really. We'd been together by that time for 20 years. Yeah, it was really because we were teaching at a Catholic university and we felt that they might disapprove of us living together in sin.
In sin. So then you moved up to Washington State in the Pacific Northwest of the United States. What was it like to live in a forest then? It must have been a bit like your childhood home.
Yes, quite. When we left Pittsburgh, we had a choice. We could have gone to New York City, where we had pretty good connections and were actually offered to share a job at Manhattan School of Music. That would have been wonderful in a way, but I think we probably wouldn't have been able to make ends meet. And much as I love New York City, it was a choice. Then, right at that point, a friend who'd been with us at Duquesne University called from Bellingham, Washington State, right up near Vancouver, and said, Charmian, there's a job going here. We'd love to have you. Can you come over and would you be interested in coming over here? He knew that I'd left Pittsburgh. So I said, I don't think so. We're pretty well settled. We're going to go to New York City. He said, well, why don't you just come over and have a look? So, I just got my driver's license because the whole time in Pittsburgh, we'd never needed a car. We were only Americans without any car. So I hopped on a flight to Vancouver, rented a car, drove across the border and down into the most beautiful part of the world. It was absolutely gorgeous. And, of course, he spoiled me rotten, took me to all the most beautiful places. And we had 10 lovely years there.
So living in a forest, what kind of animals were surrounding you then?
Oh, well, we had skunks and we had...
Bears?
Bears. We
had
bears. We were quite on the edge of the wilderness. Opposite us was a deserted apple orchard. And, of course, the bears came down from the wilderness into that apple orchard and left their little calling cards. You could tell what they'd had for breakfast.
A couple of hikers.
They never actually came to our place, fortunately. They were scaredy-cat bears. And raccoons. Raccoons were beautiful, but they were pretty destructive. They opened everybody's garbage cans and a real nuisance.
I mean, you knew how it was to live that life, but how did your urbane, metropolitan husband get on living out in the wilderness
he just
like
loved
that?
it. By that time, he was pretty much retired, and he was working on some other inventions, of course, and also he helped with all the students that I had to teach. I developed a very, very big class there rather quickly. I did quite a lot of adjudicating of competitions and that sort of thing. I was adjudicating one day in Vancouver, and I had a lady helping me who said, a child prodigy is going to play for you. And I thought, I hate child prodigies. Most of them
even though you were one?
Spoiled. No, I wasn't. I know I wasn't.
I know, you won the under-16s, didn't you?
Well, yeah, that's right. Yeah, people used to refer to me as a prodigy. But by that time, I'd seen a lot of kids who were just being pushed very hard and flattered. So I wasn't really looking forward to this too much. But a beautiful young girl came to me dressed in an Austrian costume and gave me some music. It was a very good edition of Schubert Sonata. This was an open sonata section, right, which is violin and piano together. You judge them both as one performance. And so I said, well, I guess you're playing the first movement, right? She said, no, we'll play the whole thing. That was a shock for a start. And then she went off and they came together on stage. And the little boy was 7. He was just about as tall as the piano. And they came on, they gave a very professional bow and started straight in together magnificently on this Schubert D major sonatina. And I just put down my pen and I had tears running down my cheeks. And funnily enough, that little kid, a couple of years later, came to study with us. I taught him for 2 years, and then I sent him on to university. He was 12 years old. He was a maths whiz as well as a violin whiz, and he ended up with a double doctorate at the age of 16 in maths and music.
What is it about music that a 7-year-old can make you weep when a 7-year-old has got no life experience to speak of?
That's right.
They can't communicate a life experience, or perhaps can just feel it through the music. I wonder what that is. Is it mysterious, I wonder?
It's very mysterious. I've experienced it quite a lot now because I became sort of the teacher to go to if you were a brilliant youngster, which was great. I enjoyed that very much. Yeah, there's something, I've seen it in competitions too, Richard. I follow the Menuhin competition quite a bit internationally for 2 reasons. I was on the jury with Menuhin twice in his competition. It has a youngsters and mature people age group. I think the youngsters is under 16. So you get the best child prodigies in the world at these competitions. And I found it time after time, there's just something in the way those kids play that it's unaffected. It just really gets you emotionally.
I don't know if you think much about music philosophically like this, but you think of a composer like Shostakovich, who's working during the Stalinist years of Russia. Music of that kind is kind of abstract in its own way. And because of that, he's kind of able to tell the truth of what's really going on in Russia throughout the siege of Leningrad and throughout everything else that's going on. And you can feel so much of the terror and the horror of Russia in the violence too. It's all there in his music. It seems to speak out, and Stalin recognised something in it. The idea that music of that kind can be truthful in such terrible circumstances is kind of fascinating to me. What do you think about that?
Yeah, I agree with you 100%. It's amazing, and it does. It gets to you. There's a truth in it that transcends Stalin and all that history. But as far as the little players are concerned, I can't quite figure out why they have such this ability to just get straight through to your emotions. And when they're after puberty hits, I guess, or something, they lose that. They seem to get self-conscious. They start to think, am I pleasing everybody? What will, that particular juror think of my playing?
Oh, they second-guess themselves.
I think maybe that has something to do with it.
So then do you advance as a player? The way you advance as a player is to get through that phase, to stop second-guessing yourself.
Yes, if you do get through that phase. Lots of people don't. To make it to the top as a soloist, you need to have something very special to say.
To go back to the start.
Yeah, but you can't, can you, really? It doesn't work that way. You have to somehow try to dig in there and find the truth that you had when you were younger. And a lot of it involves just ignoring a lot of what you've been told and taught and what is fashionable, because fashion is a big thing in music, unfortunately. We have to follow the fashions.
Really? What changes in the score? I mean, you've got a score in front of you. You've got the dots there, haven't you?
That's right, yeah.
You mean like the choice of composer, or is it the way
Or the way you play. For example, there's been a very big change. The time of Jascha Heifetz, who most people have forgotten now, who was the greatest violinist probably of all time. He used certain types of slides to get from one note to another, a certain type of vibrato and certain things that were uniquely him. And for 40 years or so, everybody tried to copy him. Now, not many succeeded, but certainly that was a fashion. You had to do that to get ahead, play big time, that sort of thing. And now a lot has changed there because of the historically informed kind of movement, which I was very critical of when it first happened, because a lot of people who were involved in it weren't that good players in the first place. And so they play without vibrato, a certain way of playing chords. When you play more than one note at once, you can play 4 notes sort of at once on the violin. And so, there's a big change in fashion in playing Bach, for example, an enormous change. And the historically informed movement looks into how it would have been played at the time when the composer composed it. And they're even getting up to composers like Brahms now, who was only late 19th century and early 20th, very early 20th. So they're now looking at this and realising that he took a lot more time over things than we in the sort of mid-20th century. We had to keep up the tempo, don't stop and don't slow down or this sort of thing. You play with a metronome in your veins. So that's a fashion that's changed for the better. Now it's possible to play Brahms with much more time to do things. So fashion, yes, it's a silly thing, but performers do have to follow it.
So despite this lovely life you're having, living in the woods in the Pacific Northwest of the United States, you came back to Australia in the mid-80s. What brought you back, Charmian?
My mother was getting old and Richard's family were growing up here and they had children, so Richard wanted to be closer to his son and grandchildren.
So you and Richard and your mum were living under the same roof. How did that work out?
I had to look after both of them virtually. Unfortunately, they didn't get on very well. They were very similar and had very similar ideas on just about everything, but for some reason they rubbed each other the wrong way.
And under the same roof too.
Under the same roof, it was a bit difficult for me.
So with you looking after both of them and both of their health was failing, who was it that you lost first?
Richard, in 91. Well, he was a smoker and he had emphysema and, all sorts of things went wrong gradually, particularly his lungs. He was working on an invention. In fact, the day before he died, I'd taken him off to see somebody who was making a model for him of some new thing. I think it was a page turner, an automatic page turner thing. Brilliant, beautiful. And when I told these people that he'd died the next day, they couldn't believe it. They just couldn't believe it. It was very sudden, fortunately, which is a much better way to go, of course. But in a way, I was expecting it, yes. I could see that his health was on the rocks. And I was just happy that he was so, his brain was 100%.
And then 2 years later, after your mother died, you went off to New York to buy a violin.
Yes, I sold the house in Balmain for much, much more than I bought it for. I'd put a lot into it, of course. And there I had that feeling that, I had a little bit to spare. So I went to New York with some friends, including Tony, my new partner now, and a girl, a student from Turkey who was studying with me at the time. We all went to New York together, and I walked into the shop of Jacques Francais, who was one of the biggest dealers of all time, and played this instrument made by Matteo Goffrilla of Venice. And I just fell in love with it. It had everything that I'd always wanted in a violin and strived for.
What was it like to pick it up and play it in the shop?
Just marvellous. Yeah, particularly with those two there just listening and seeing my response.
And what was the price tag on it?
It was $100,000 at the time.
Whoa!
US. But because I just sold my house, I had it. That was my concert instrument from then on.
Is there a thing where a violin can actually, you feel your voice meets it or something like that?
Yes. It speaks somehow the language you want. This is a deep-sounding violin, not a very soprano one, although it does have a great deal of sweetness to it. And it's a gutsy violin, all the things that were part of me.
So you played that for many years. When did you realise that your concert performance days might be coming to an end?
Well, actually, probably that instrument had something to do with it. When I came back to Australia, I was teaching at first of all, the Canberra School of Music and then the Sydney Conservatorium. Then we started the Macquarie Trio with Kathy Selby and Michael Goldschlager. Kathy lived in Sydney, but Michael lived in Perth. So every program that we did with the trio, Michael had to fly in. He'd stay with us usually. We had an apartment in Sydney then. And we'd rehearse madly for probably 3 or 4 days or something. Totally new program, and play that for the concert at Macquarie University. And also we had a series in the city, always, various different places. And another one was the beautiful St. James Church. That was my favourite. So each time we had to give a new program, and it had to be rehearsed when Michael came in. So there was very little time to rehearse, really. So we rehearsed great long times, and then we started making CDs for you people, the ABC, classics. And the first one was 2 Beethoven trios. And the second one was 2 Mendelssohn trios. Now, when you've got a great crew sitting by in the studios in Ultimo, you get almost get something perfect, because CDs are really constructed things. You know, you play first of all, and then you start correcting things that might not sound good on a CD. You know, somebody misses a little shift somewhere, or somebody plays out of tune somewhere, or we're not quite together somewhere, and this mounts up. Then you've got 6 hours of recording, right? I'm not used to playing 6 hours because I've been teaching. You know, I might practice 2 hours a day if I was lucky. And so playing these 6 hours, I started to get pain through my left hand. And the first CD, we noticed it, but the second one, it got pretty bad. And, you know, if the 6 hours didn't quite get it, then you stay longer and you do another few takes of something until you've got it in the can, as they call it.
With more and more pain in the hand.
More and more pain in my hand. So the second one, then I actually went to a doctor and they said they thought it was Dupuytren's syndrome, which is where your hand goes like that. I do have it on this hand.
You mean where the fingers splay in the middle?
The fingers splay somehow. It didn't happen on my left hand, but nevertheless I could feel that I was not going to be able to play the way that I used to play.
So it was like cramping up then, was it?
No, it was just pain, just sheer pain. And lots of things that I couldn't quite do to my satisfaction. So it broke my heart, but I had to leave the trio. That was sad because it was something I really loved doing. I took a year or so off, but my friends kept me playing chamber music. We'd have a weekend of drinking nice wine and that sort of thing, and we'd just get our instruments and play just for fun. And so that got me back again to playing, and this was no longer hurting. So obviously it wasn't Dupuytren's syndrome, it was just a strain. And over the years it's gotten better and better, and I've done more and more playing. So I'm still at it. I haven't played for a while now, and I'm not sure if I'll be able to again, because I do have an arthritis condition which is creeping up on me.
Do you play for pleasure?
Yes. Yeah, always, yeah. It's such a wonderful thing to have in your life.
So today you live not far from where you grew up. Is your old family home still standing from the 1940s?
Yes, believe it or not, it is, yeah.
Yes.
It was just a pioneer shack, but it's still standing and somebody's living in it.
And what music do you play today that reminds you of Richard?
Any of the chamber music, of course, reminds me of Richard, and also any of the solo stuff that I studied with him. And we taught together for so many years. You know, I was very, very lucky to teach under his guidance when I first started, because when I first started teaching, I didn't get talented students. So I was teaching people who were not beginners, but they weren't advanced students. And so I really had to learn how to teach from very early stages. And I found that I did enjoy it very, very much. I seemed to have a good way of getting into somebody's psyche and figuring out where they are in their thinking and in their playing, and then to meet them on that level and just take them to the next level without thinking, you know, this is going to be a Jascha Heifetz or something. And so it's sort of ironic in a way that I ended up teaching all the brilliant ones. Became such a hallmark of my career, and it's very, very rewarding.
It's been lovely speaking with you, Charmian. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
That's just a little bit of Mozart's Piano Quartet in G minor, performed there by Charmian Gadd, playing that beautiful Goffrilo violin with Boris Berman and Theodore Kuscher and Tim Hugh. I'm Richard Feidler. Thanks for listening.
You've been listening to a podcast of Conversations with Richard Feidler. For more Conversations interviews, please go to the website abc.net.au/conversations.
Discover more great ABC podcasts, live radio and exclusives on the ABC Listen app.